many of the farm stands, you'll see a whole vast amount of pumpkins, just of every size and shape. But there is this process that takes place, and we know because we went to a farm yesterday, and you end up going through and looking at all of the pumpkins, and somehow you end up being drawn to the one that most fits whatever your image of a perfect pumpkin should look like. And so there's a bunch of them, and you skip over some, right? And you could even tell that the farmers themselves are terribly uncomfortable with the ugly ones, because what they do is they take them and they paint funny faces on them, and they try to sell them as something other than the ugly pumpkin that they are, because they know that if they leave it like that, no one's going to buy those, right? They're just going to sit there. So you go through and you end up sorting out and picking out the ones you want, and you always wonder, as you go through, some of the ones that are a little deformed, what happens to those? Does anyone actually ever buy them? And indeed, if you've ever passed an actual pumpkin patch, you will find at the end of this season, somewhere in early November, that it's actually the tractors who go out then, and they take all the ones that no one wanted anymore, all the ones that no one wanted to purchase or to buy, and they actually grate them up, and they put them back into the soil to give vitamins and nutrients back to the soil. But there is this whole process, that takes place about picking and choosing. And I think it's probably true of most fruits when we go shopping, or it's definitely true if you go over to the meat section of a store. You're picking a roast that looks most like whatever in your mind, represents a roast. We are always selecting that which is more appealing than another to us. And we're very dismissive of that which isn't appealing to us. A lot of this sometimes even happens with people, if we're honest. It is not uncommon now in the course of a day or a week to encounter someone, who has lost a limb. And so you will find a lot of individuals now with, prosthetics that allow them to function just like everyone else. But in the summer, if they're wearing shorts, those are very noticeable. And it is not unusual that you sort of stop and stare. There's something about individuals being somewhat deformed or different than everyone else that draws your attention. And for some of us, we're actually turned off by that, and we find ourselves distant. You'll find it now with some diseases as well that impact the face or the body, and there are growths that grow, and people are distancing themselves from them out of fear. I say all this because this is part of the mentality where Mark's coming from when he talks about cutting off your hand, your foot, gouging your eye, and everything else. We don't know this because you and I, as Christians, we are not as steeped in Hebrew scriptures as Jesus' audience would have been. But I want you to hear what is written in Leviticus. So this pertains to who can enter the Holy of Holies within the temple. If you remember, in Jerusalem, there are varying degrees, and behind this one last section, there is a huge drape, a curtain that hangs, and behind that is actually where they placed the Ark of the Covenant. In that space is where the high priest once a year would go in and offer an offering of incense. And in Leviticus, which is one of the first 5 books of the Bible as it was given to and as it developed under Moses and his offspring, Leviticus writes, "The Lord spoke to Moses, speak to Aaron and say," Aaron is Moses' son, "speak to Aaron and say, no one of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, one who is blind or lame, or one who has been mutilated in face or limb. For no one who has a broken foot, or a broken hand, or a hunchback, or a dwarf, or a man with a blemish in his eyes, or itching disease, or scabs, or crushed any part of his body, no descendant of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to offer the Lord's offering by fire. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer or be in the presence of God. Mark's community is clearly aware that even God, based on Leviticus, is very selective about who God wants in his presence. And so all of this time, there is this clear understanding for our Hebrew brothers and sisters at the time of Jesus that anyone who is blemished in any way is not acceptable to God. Anyone who is blemished in any way is not acceptable to God. If you cannot enter the Holy of Holies to give an offering on behalf or a sacrifice on behalf of the people, then how is it that you expect to get into heaven where you are entering the holiest of holies? And so Mark's audience knows this. Jesus knows this. And so remember, we've talked about this, that if people were sick at time of Jesus, they thought that it was something they've done. And that sickness separates them from God and is actually a result of either their sin or the sin of, their family members, the generations before them. And here in this regard, Leviticus has very clear law about who can worship before the Lord, who can step into the Holy of Holies and give an offering. And now we have in the gospel that Mark sets out that Jesus is saying exactly the opposite. Jesus turns it upside down. And trust me, we hear this and we think about mutilation and we think about cutting off hands and stuff. Isn't that straight? But what Jesus is actually doing is Jesus is proclaiming. Mark is proclaiming a truth of the teaching of Jesus that if you are deformed, meaning if you are sinful, you are accepted into God's presence. Sin is the greatest deformity for Mark. Sin is the thing that keeps us separated from God, not our physical appearance. But Jesus takes it and actually reverses everything that Leviticus says, because according to Leviticus, no one who is sinful can enter into the presence of God, because no one who is deformed in any way has access to God. You actually have to be a perfected human being in order to enter the presence of God. And here Jesus turns around and goes, no. It is better that you have no hand, no foot, no eye, that you are deformed in some way, but yet still you are entering into heaven, into God's presence. And he goes forward to say, by the way, if you think by having 2 good feet and 2 good hands that you are better and better prepared to be in God's presence, that somehow your perfect form gains you access, I have news for you. You may be in Gehenna, hell, before, those who are deformed. Now, for us, we listen to this and we're passé about it, but understand that Jesus is taking a fundamental part of the scriptures and the understanding and the practice of the day. This is the actual practice of the temple at the time of Jesus. This is what everyone knows. Everyone knows this law, and everyone understands that if you are deformed, or in this even went back to saying that if you had a really bad case of acne, you were not considered whole and somehow distanced from God. Well, if this is the case and Jesus is coming along saying, no, it is absolutely acceptable to God to accept you exactly the way you are in your human deformity, if that is the case, or in your sinfulness. And we're always really uncomfortable because we believe that somehow we need to be in a certain state of perfection or grace or spiritual preparedness that God accepts us. And yet Jesus is saying, no. God accepts you the way you are, and the fact that you are approaching God is already the faith that you need to be in God's presence. And by the way, You may be deformed, but that doesn't mean that God does not love you profoundly in your deformity. In fact, Jesus would sort of say that God is sort of attracted to us in our deformity, in our brokenness. That God is more drawn to us because of the fact we are broken than when we feel that we are absolutely righteous in his sight and we can stand on our own and we stand with pride that actually probably separates us more than our sinfulness. And so Jesus' audience knows of this, and when they hear Jesus, this is radical. You want to talk about scribes and Pharisees of the day being put off by Jesus and what he is saying? This would be ridiculous to them. They would hear this and they would get totally scathingly mad because Jesus is saying something that actually reverses something that has always been understood as part of their tradition, a part of what they are. Now, for you and I, we have to get comfortable with the fact that we are, quote unquote, deformed, and that somehow, though we are ugly pumpkins, God is still attracted to us and would choose to purchase us over a more perfected pumpkin that might be next to us. And we might be uncomfortable with that because we have been taught or we believe that somehow we have to be at a certain level. But what if the reality of Jesus' presence here on earth, if there was one central tenet, if there was one central principle to who and what Jesus is all about, what if that one truth is that you and I can find refuge in him? What if the one truth is that the Son of God comes so that if we so choose, we can hide inside this Christ? That God then no longer sees us, but he sees the Jesus that covers us and embraces us and draws us close to himself. What if that one tenet is that in all of our brokenness, in all of our ugly pumpkinness, that somehow it is Jesus himself who is our refuge? Just the person of Jesus is our refuge. In the simplicity of what that statement is meant to be, in the simplicity of the statement of how it was just spoken, what if it is that simple that this Jesus is and has been and always will be that centerpiece of refuge if we so choose? And so in all of our brokenness and all of our frailty and everything else that we believe and see and others tell us about ourselves and all the talking we do to ourselves in the course of a day, I probably think that I probably talk to myself more in the course of a day than anyone else talks to me. But what are we saying to ourselves? And what does that conversation look like? And are we always pointing at ourselves, always putting us down? And if we're always focused on that which is wrong with us, the blemishes that we have, does it distract us from the love and the refuge that Jesus is? Because you can't be paying attention to two things at the same time. And if we're paying attention to that which is always wrong with us, right? Right now, if you go into the medical practice, they say that you should become a plastic surgeon. Right now, the number one need and the largest grossing medical profession in our country is plastic surgery. And it is because we are a society overwhelmed with how we appear. And so any little blemish, we're always trying to have taken care of. We always want to make us something that we're not and try to perfect in us whatever is been created or distinctively different about us than somebody else. That type of overwhelming, continuous self-loathing, it has to go beyond just being skin deep. It has to be something deeper inside each and every one of us that somehow we feel that we're not enough. And that if I fix my nose, and don't get me wrong, if if there's something wrong with the nose and you could have it fixed, okay. But if it goes to simply cosmetics, and if we're simply trying to create something that we feel is appealing, doesn't it strike you that maybe every day of our lives we're also doing that inside ourselves, never really content with where we are and not content with who we are? And because of that, then we're never content with anything around us, including what we look at in the mirror. And if that is the case, how attracted will we be to God, who is ultimately the mirror of all that is beauty, all that is goodness? If we try to come close to God, aren't we going to feel that we're not done enough, that we're not perfected enough? Like, maybe I'll be more attractive to God if I get my nose done. You know, if my left ear was just a little bit higher than my right ear, maybe I'll be more attractive to God. And I'm not making fun. I'm simply saying, is there a process of thought that you and I buy into because we've been taught to, and that our society teaches us to? But if that is the case, and we're not happy with the way we look, and we're not happy with the way we feel about ourselves, then where is the joy and the beauty in this life? And isn't it quite possible that the way all of that needs to be addressed is by first and foremost seeing ourselves as God sees us, and understanding that we are acceptable exactly the way we are, exactly the way we've been created, exactly what God has gifted us and talented us to be? The answer for this, the impact of this, isn't just about eternal life. Sure, absolutely, our relationship with God. But I think it resonates a lot more about how we simply enjoy and live our life now, in today. Like how the rest of the day rolls out, how our morning was. You know, what thoughts, what was running through our mind all day today? You know, did we get up as we were brushing our hair? Did we say, you know, I really wish, you know, this wasn't this or that wasn't that, and, you know, if I can lose 20 pounds, my life would be perfect? I mean, is that really how God wanted us to live our life? Continuously critical of who and what we are? Or are we really meant to celebrate what we are first, and then out of the joy and the love that we have for ourselves, that transformation takes place? See, in our relationship with God, people would have you believe if you are terrified and if you are fearful of God, then in that terror and in that fear, you draw closer to God. Well, I don't understand that, because if you're standing and you're getting ready to hit your child, or if you stand and you have your arms open for an embrace, I assure you the child is going to run into the open arms over being invited by the smack of a hand. I think the same thing is true with God. I think the exact same thing is true with God. But it is up to us to change the way we think about ourselves and to analyze how we are thinking, because the impact of that makes all the difference of our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with our very selves. God bless you.